There is a house in Norfolk that has never fully belonged to anyone who did not earn it the hard way. Sandringham sits on 20,000 acres of English countryside, quiet and enormous, surrounded by farmland and forest, and the kind of silence that only centuries of history can produce. Kings have died inside its walls, queens have wept in its corridors, children have run through its gardens not yet knowing they would one day carry the weight of a crown. For the British royal family, Sandringham is not just a property, it is a feeling. It is the closest thing they have ever had to a home that felt genuinely private, genuinely theirs, away from the pageantry and the press, and the relentless performance that every other royal residence demands of its inhabitants. And nobody understood that feeling more deeply, more personally, more fiercely than Princess Anne. She had spent every Christmas of her childhood at Sandringham. She had ridden horses across its grounds before most children her age could ride a bicycle. She had walked those frost-hardened paths beside her father, Prince Philip, who taught her that duty was not something you performed for an audience, but something you lived whether anyone was watching or not. She had sat in those rooms with her mother, Queen Elizabeth II, who ruled for 70 years and never once mistook comfort for weakness. Anne had absorbed all of it. The land, the silence, the sense of obligation that came with being born into a family that was not simply a family but an institution. That is why, when the dynamics inside Sandringham began to shift after Queen Elizabeth's death in September 2022, Anne felt it differently from the others, more personally, more quietly. And when the time came, she responded to it in the only way she knew how, without drama, without spectacle, and without apology. The story of what happened at Sandringham between Princess Anne and Queen Camilla did not begin with a single argument or a single event. It began the way most significant things begin in royal households, slowly, almost invisibly, through the accumulation of small moments that individually seem unremarkable, but together form a pattern that cannot be ignored. When King Charles III inherited Sandringham after his mother's death, he inherited the whole complex apparatus that surrounded it. The staff, the traditions, the unwritten rules about who stayed where and when and why. For decades under Queen Elizabeth, those arrangements had been clear. Sandringham had rhythms that the family followed instinctively, seasonal patterns of use and access that everyone understood without needing to be told. The late Queen had made those patterns herself, and they had the permanence of something built into the stone of the place. What happened after her death was that those patterns became open to renegotiation, not loudly, not publicly, but in the careful, deliberate way that power always renegotiates itself when the person who held it is gone. Camilla, now Queen Consort and then Queen, stepped into a role that had no precise roadmap. Queen Elizabeth had not created a manual for being her successor. Nobody had. And Camilla, to her credit, approached her expanded responsibilities with a determination and seriousness that even her critics were forced to acknowledge. But seriousness is not the same thing as sensitivity. And ambition, even when it is entirely legitimate, is not always careful about whose history it disturbs. The tension between Princess Anne and Camilla was not new. It had roots that went back decades, back to the years when Charles and Camilla's relationship was the source of enormous pain inside the royal family, when Diana's suffering was visible to the entire world, and Anne found herself in the impossible position of loving her brother while watching what his choices cost the people around him. Anne had never been given to theatrical declarations or public statements of outrage. She dealt with her feelings the way she dealt with most things, by getting on with her work and keeping her thoughts to herself. But people who knew her well understood that she had not forgotten. She was not built for forgetting. Their relationship had evolved over the years. By the time Charles became king and Camilla took her place beside him, Anne had publicly acknowledged Camilla's importance to her brother's life, and had done so with genuine warmth. In November 2024, Anne awarded Camilla an honorary doctorate at the University of London in a ceremony that was, by all accounts, warm and gracious. The two women arrived together, traveled together, and appeared entirely at ease in each other's company. When Camilla, in a gesture of deference, invited Anne to enter the room first before the ceremony began, Anne politely but firmly declined. Protocol required that Camilla enter first, given her higher position in the line of royal precedence, and Anne would not allow even a well-intentioned gesture of respect to override the rules that governed such occasions. It was a small moment, but it was an entirely Anne moment, precise, principled, and immovable. That capacity for immovability was exactly what defined what happened next. Among those who have spent time studying the inner workings of the royal household, there has long been an understanding that Sandringham represented something different from the other royal properties. Buckingham Palace is the office. Windsor Castle is the stage. Balmoral is the escape. But Sandringham was, and had always been, the home. The place where the royal family was allowed to be something other than a monarchy. Christmas mornings and long walks, and the specific kind of informality that only exists in places where generations of the same family have lived and grieved and celebrated together. When Queen Elizabeth died, that sense of home did not automatically transfer to whoever now held the keys. A house can pass from one person to another in a moment. The feeling a house carries takes generations to build. Anne understood this. She had been carrying that feeling her entire life. Reports began to circulate in royal circles about plans to reorganize how Sandringham was used, particularly during the summer months when the estate was at its most peaceful. Like any large private estate, Sandringham has multiple wings and residential sections, spaces that have historically been designated for different members of the family or used for specific purposes. The reorganization being discussed was not, on its face, unreasonable. Estates are managed. Spaces are reconsidered. That is simply what happens when circumstances change. But some of the specific proposals being discussed touched directly on arrangements that Anne had long regarded as settled. Parts of the estate that had been organized in one way for decades, carrying the specific imprint of her mother's preferences and priorities, were apparently under consideration for repurposing in ways that would fundamentally alter their character. The changes were practical in nature, framed in the language of efficiency and modernization. But to Anne, they felt like something else. She had watched the royal family navigate a sustained period of internal turbulence since her mother's death. She had watched Harry and Meghan's departure reshape the public's understanding of what royal life actually cost the people inside it. She had watched her brother deal with a serious illness while simultaneously trying to maintain the stability of the institution he had inherited. She had watched Camilla step into expanded public duties with considerable skill, managing the demands of a role that the public had once rejected her for with a quiet persistence that was, by most measures, admirable. But admiration for someone's professional conduct does not require the surrender of everything that mattered before they arrived, and Anne had no intention of pretending otherwise. What happened in the period that followed was characteristically Anne. No press statement. No palace briefing designed to reach the tabloids through the usual channels. No theatrical confrontation that would give anyone the story they were looking for. What happened was that the appropriate parties were made clearly and firmly aware that certain arrangements at Sandringham were not available for renegotiation, that the specific character of those spaces, the history they held, the purposes they had served for decades under Queen Elizabeth, would be honored. And that this was not a subject on which Anne was prepared to be flexible. The effect of that clarity was immediate and significant. The staff at Sandringham, who had served the royal family long enough to understand the difference between a request and a declaration, adjusted their understanding of what was and was not possible. Certain plans were quietly set aside. The reorganization that had been under discussion proceeded in ways that did not require the spaces in question to be fundamentally changed. Palace insiders, the reliable but anonymous chorus that has always surrounded the British monarchy, described the moment in various ways. Some used words like standoff, others described it as a clarification. A few, speaking to outlets that specialize in the careful translation of royal discretion, used the word decisive. All of them, regardless of how they framed it, conveyed the same basic fact, that Princess Anne had drawn a line and the line had held. What made the story interesting to the people who followed royal affairs closely was not the specific details of what had been decided about which rooms at Sandringham. Those details were, in the larger context of world events, almost comically mundane. What made it interesting was what the story revealed about the internal architecture of the new royal household. King Charles had inherited an institution that was, in many ways, more fragile than it had appeared from the outside. The death of Queen Elizabeth had removed the single figure who had served as the reference point for every question about what the royal family was and what it was for. Her authority had been so complete, so long established, that it had made the institution feel stable even when the individuals inside it were anything but. Without her, those individuals were navigating the question of what the monarchy meant in the 21st century, without the benefit of a settled answer. Camilla had emerged as one of the more capable navigators of that uncertainty. Her public role had expanded significantly during Charles's period of illness, and she had met those expanded responsibilities with a professionalism that had reshaped public opinion of her considerably. The woman who had once been, in the eyes of many, the villain of the Charles and Diana story had become, with time and persistence and a great deal of hard work, something closer to an asset. But assets operate within systems, and systems have people who remember how those systems were built and why. Anne was one of those people. She was the last surviving member of the generation that had built Sandringham into what it was. She had been there for all of it, the post-war simplicity of her childhood Christmases, the shift in public culture that made royal privacy harder to maintain, the crises that had tested the institution in ways that previous generations could not have anticipated. She had watched it all and worked through all of it, largely without recognition and almost entirely without complaint. She was not going to watch the physical spaces that held all of that history be quietly reorganized in ways that served the present at the expense of the past. The palace, for its part, said nothing publicly. That is almost always how it goes with the British royal family. The institutional reflex toward silence is so deeply embedded that even significant internal disputes tend to leave almost no public trace. The story of what happened at Sandringham filtered out through the usual channels. A word here, a phrase there, sources described only as familiar with the matter, and it accumulated into a picture that was suggestive without being definitive. But the picture it suggested was clear enough. Princess Anne, who had spent her entire life operating in the shadow of her more prominent brothers while quietly doing more actual work than almost anyone else in the family, had protected something she believed was worth protecting. Not for herself. She had her own house, her own estate at Gatcombe Park in Gloucestershire, her own life that was full enough and grounded enough that she did not need Sandringham to validate her sense of who she was. She had done it because some things are not worth the cost of letting them go. Because a house without its history is just walls and rooms. Because the people who understood what Sandringham meant were running out of time to say so. And because Anne, who had never once in her life waited for someone to give her permission to do the right thing, was not about to start now. In the weeks and months that followed, the broader royal household adjusted. The relationships within it remained what they had always been, complicated, shaped by history, held together by a shared commitment to an institution that all of them, in their different ways, believed in. Anne and Camilla continued to appear at public engagements, continued to present to the world the image of a family that was functional and unified and purposeful. The documentary reality of their dynamic, the specific weights and tensions that only people inside it could fully feel, remained where it had always been, out of the camera's reach, inside the walls of houses that had been keeping royal secrets since before any of them were born. But at Sandringham, something had been settled, quietly, firmly, in the way that Princess Anne had always preferred to settle things. The wing in question remained what it had always been. The history it held remained intact. And the woman who had spent her entire life proving that you could carry an institution on your back without ever asking for credit had, once again, done exactly that. The palace had been stunned, but not surprised. They never were with Anne.